Thank you very much. The title of tonight's talk is Future Sex, the End of Gay, ? What I want to do is step back from the day-to-day struggle for LGBT plus rights and liberation to take you on a journey to examine the future evolution of human sexuality and its implications for both LGBT and straight communities. I'm confining this discussion to the issue of sexual orientation and will leave the equally important issue of gender identity to another occasion. My starting point is that in most parts of the world today, homophobia, biphobia, and lesbophobia are in decline. There is, of course, still a long way to go. We've made huge progress, there are still many battles to fight, and there is backlash in some countries. But the long-term global historical trend is very, very clear. Worldwide, the trajectory is for the repeal of anti-LGBT laws and for increasing acceptance and understanding. So sexual difference doesn't hold the same fear and phobia in many parts of the world that it once did. In some parts of the world it is still very potent, but in other parts it is in retreat. And that is a huge tribute to the success of LGBT plus movements and indeed the support and solidarity of our straight friends and allies. So overall, I would say that LGBT people are gaining rights, not losing them. As I mentioned, there are examples of backlash. Intensified repression in countries like Russia and the former Soviet Communist Empire, Poland, Hungary, and so on. Plus, of course, in large parts of Africa, the Middle East, and parts of South Asia. But if we take the long view, in world historical terms, LGBT attitudes and support is on the rise. Often too slowly and not nearly as fast as we would like. But overall, we are making progress right across the planet. Now this begs the question, as homophobia diminishes and as societies eventually embrace a post-homophobic culture, how will this transition to equality, dignity, understanding and acceptance affect the expression of human sexuality? Human sexuality, like everything else, is cultural. It's not fixed in stone. It has evolved over the centuries, and it will continue to evolve. So let's take a look at how it might evolve in the future. I would say that if human civilization evolves into a state of sexual enlightenment, where the differences between hetero and homo no longer matter, or no longer matter as much, what would this mean for the future of same-sex desire and same-sex identity? Now, we already know, thanks to a host of sex surveys, that bisexuality is a fact of life, and that even in many narrow-minded homophobic cultures, many people have a sexuality that is, to varying degrees, capable of both heterosexual and homosexual attraction. That's a reality. The surveys show that. It's also apparent that same-sex relations often flourish, albeit temporarily, in single-sex institutions like schools, prisons, and the armed forces. All of this would suggest that human sexuality may be more flexible than many people assume. If we go back to the research of Dr. Alfred Kinsey in the United States in the 1940s. His research provided the first major statistical evidence that gay and straight are not watertight, irreconcilable, and mutually exclusive sexual orientations. He found that human sexuality is in fact a continuum of desires and behaviours, ranging from exclusive heterosexuality to exclusive homosexuality. He found that a substantial proportion of the population shares an amalgam of same-sex and opposite-sex feelings and attractions, even if they do not act upon them. So, in his groundbreaking work, Sexual Behaviour in the Human Male, in 1948, Kinsey recorded that 13% of the men he surveyed were either mostly or exclusively homosexual for at least 3 years between the ages of 16 and 55. He also found that 25% of the men had more than incidental gay reactions or experiences, which amounted to clear and continuing same-sex desires. 25%. Altogether, 37% of the men that Kinsey questioned had experienced sex with other males to the point of orgasm. That's more than 1/3. And half said they had experienced mental attraction or erotic arousal towards other men, albeit sometimes transient and not physically expressed. Now that goes completely against what we are told now about the incidence of same-sex desire in our society and the possibility of that desire in our society. It's true that Kinsey's statistics on same-sex behaviour have since been criticised as out of date, exaggerated, and unrepresentative. And immediately after the war, when many men were isolated from the opportunities of sex with women, it's true that probably created a situational experience of same-sex behaviour that would not have existed during peacetime. But, and this is the big but, his idea of a spectrum of human sexuality has tended to be reinforced by subsequent surveys that have also shown that a significant proportion of the population have had sexual relations with both men and women. So to give you some examples, a British sex survey conducted by ICM for the Observer newspaper in 2008 found that 16% of women reported sexual contact with another woman, and 10% of men said they had sexual contact with another man. This is way higher than the 5 to 10% statistical figure that we are told about time and time again. The Observer did a subsequent poll a few years later, I think about 2016, which revealed even greater shifts in sexual behaviour. That survey found that 23% of young people aged 16 to 24 had had a same-sex experience. 23%, almost 1/4. Now, all these figures are much higher than the number of people who are exclusively gay or lesbian or who define themselves as such. Much, much higher. There was also, about 4 years ago, another survey by YouGov which found that 49% of young people in the age bracket 16 to 24 said they would not define themselves as 100% straight. That's almost half of young people saying they did not define themselves as 100% straight. They were acknowledging the possibility that they may have an element of same-sex desire and attraction. Now, we have to face the reality. Society and culture is changing. Sexual identities and behaviour are changing. The possibility that individuals can share a capacity for both hetero and homo behaviour is an idea that was also researched and documented by the anthropologists Cullen Ford and Frank Beach. In the book they published, Patterns of Sexual Behaviour in 1965, they noted that certain forms of homosexuality were considered normal and accepted in 49 out of 76 tribal pre-capitalist societies that have been surveyed by anthropologists in the period from the 1920s to the 1950s. That's nearly 2/3 of those societies not impinged by Western influences and culture had various forms of acceptance or normalization of same-sex behavior. In some cases, including the institutionalization of these individuals as special and unique, and often being given venerated positions within those societies. They also recorded, this is Cullen Ford and Frank Beach, they also recorded that in some Aboriginal cultures, such as the Karaki and Sambia peoples of Papua New Guinea, all young men entered into a same-sex relationship with an unmarried male warrior, sometimes lasting several years, as part of their rites of passage into manhood. Once completed, they ceased all homosexual contact and assumed sexual desires for women and married them. Now, I'm hastening to add, I'm not in any way endorsing this behaviour, but I'm giving it as an example. I'm giving it as an example of the flexibility and fluidity of sexual behaviour and expression. If sexual orientation was totally biologically pre-programmed at birth, these men in these Aboriginal tribal societies would never have been able to switch to homosexuality and then back to heterosexuality with such apparent ease. This led Ford and Beach to deduce that homosexuality is fundamental to the human species, and that its practice is substantially influenced by social mores and cultural expectations. Again, this was reinforced by the Masters and Johnson US studies in the 1960s and 70s. They also concluded that same-sex desire was fundamental to the human species, and of course there's been over 500 animal studies which have shown that same-sex behaviour exists in other non-human species. So I think the evidence is very clear. Sociology, anthropology, biological science and research shows that the incidence and form of heterosexuality and homosexuality is not fixed and universal, that it varies in different societies during different epochs. Homosexuality today in Britain is very different from Tudor England or in the age of the Vikings. Homosexuality today in lots of countries is so different from the historical past. Look at homosexuality in Meiji Japan or Imperial China, very different from how it is expressed today. It also shows, I think, that the two sexual orientations, heterosexual and homosexual, are not mutually exclusive. There is a good deal of fluidity and overlap. Now, what's more, although scientific evidence shows that human sexuality is significantly influenced by biological predispositions, such as genes and hormones in the womb, other influences appear to be cultural, including social expectations, peer pressure, and the availability and opportunity for sexual release. So there's been a host of studies that show that even in very repressive Muslim societies, where sexual relations before marriage between men and women are not only frowned upon but severely punished, there is an astronomically high incidence of covert same-sex behaviour. Young men needing sexual release would never define themselves as gay or bisexual, but they have sex with other men as a form and means of sexual release. The influences that we have and experience, and the research evidences, is that these various cultural influences, in addition to the biological predispositions, will channel erotic impulses in certain directions and not others. An individual's sexual orientation is thus significantly culturally as well as biologically determined. And therefore we can conclude, I think, with reasonable degree of certainty that as culture changes, manifestations of sexuality are also likely to change. Now, the evidence I've talked about, the examples, the research, that comes from consciously recognized and admitted desires. You know, the fact there is considerable crossover between LGB and straight relationships comes from research that records what people have consciously been aware of and have admitted to researchers. But if any of us know anything about psychology, there is the unconscious as well. And at the level of unconscious desires and feelings, where attractions and passions are often repressed, displaced, sublimated, projected and transferred, it seems probable that very few people are 100% straight or gay. Most are a mixture. Even if they never mentally acknowledge it, even if they never physically express it. So what I'm trying to say is that this picture of human sexuality is much more complex, diverse and blurred than the traditional simplistic binary image of hetero and homo. An image that is so beloved by straight moralists who want to put us down, but also equally significantly by many LGBT people. They cling to these fixed notions. And I'll come on to why that is the case, but they cling to these notions as if there could never be change. Now, I want to digress a little bit and tell you from a personal experience, and I give a trigger warning. If any of you are a sensitive disposition, please, close your ears or leave the room. I feel 100% gay. I have never had or wanted to have sexual relations with a woman. I love women. I'm physically, mentally, emotionally attracted to many women. Some of the most important people in my life are women. I'm not repelled in any way by heterosexual sex, by vaginas or breasts. I think that's part of the spectrum and beauty of human physicality and sexuality. But I ask myself, if I was shipwrecked and marooned on a desert island with only one other person who happened to be a woman, and we were stuck there for a long time, I suspect that I would probably at least try to have sexual relations with her. And that doesn't make me afraid or anxious or uncomfortable. That's a reality. And for many straight men who've been in similar situations, they've seen themselves as 100% straight, but in extraordinary circumstances, they've ended up having sex with other men. And I know quite a few, or did it before they died, quite a few straight men who served in the Second World War, who saw themselves as 100% straight, but stuck in a POW camp under Japanese rule in the Pacific, had sex with other men as a release. And they don't feel ashamed or embarrassed about it. Anyway, I'm going to go into a little bit more explicit detail. I have occasional wet dreams, and I enjoy them very much. But once I had a straight wet dream. And I have never fancied Uma Thurman, consciously, but in this straight wet dream, I was at a party, and Uma Thurman came up to me, we began chatting, and she became very amorous and started kissing me. And initially I was very shocked, and but I wanted to be polite and courteous, so I didn't pull away or push her off. But then I thought, actually, this is quite nice, you know. I'm gay, this is very strange, but I'm quite enjoying this. Next thing is, she drags me off to a little cubicle and starts playing with my genitals, and I get an erection. Shock, horror. The next thing, we start taking off our clothes. I start touching her breasts and vagina, and this is a completely new experience for me. And I remember thinking in the dream how strange this was and how unexpected and how, well, quite shocking it was. But I went with the flow. I thought, well, you know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So we got naked in my wet dream, and I had a raging erection. And then, being a very well-trained gay man, of course, you can't have unsafe sex. You've got to have a condom. But then I panicked and thought, if I fumble around trying to get a condom, I'm sure to lose my erection. So I had this panic moment. I did slightly lose my erection, but I got the condom, got it on, and then we had sex. It was amazing. And I remember thinking in my dream, wow, this is just so unexpected, unusual, and I'm enjoying it. Go with the flow. I've got to tell you, the orgasm was so powerful that I woke up in bed, shaking and gasping for about 3 or 4 minutes afterwards. So I tell you that story in order to illustrate that if you're really in touch with your feelings and emotions, if you're able to dig down deep, I think a lot of us who may see ourselves as 100% straight or 100% gay may actually, in certain circumstances, be open to a different experience. So my conclusion is that sexual expression is often situational and culturally influenced. There is an element of indeterminacy and flexibility, and this means that the present forms of homosexuality and heterosexuality are conditional. They're unlikely to remain the same in perpetuity. As culture changes, so will expressions of sexuality, as we have seen them change over the millennia of recorded history in different cultures. In a future non-homophobic society, as the taboo around same-sex relations recede, I would calculate that more people are likely to have gay sex. Even if only experimentally, even if only for a few months or years. What I think is really interesting about that prognosis is that the demise of homophobia is likely to reduce the need to assert and affirm LGBT identity. I say that because LGBT identities are largely the product of homophobic prejudice and repression. They came into existence as a self-defense mechanism against homophobia. Faced with persecution for having same-sex relations, the right to have those relations had to be defended. Hence, LGBT identity and the LGBT rights movement. In the ancient world, there was no sense of LGBT identity. It didn't exist. The Catholic Church actually had it right. They saw the sin of sodomy as an immorality that could befall any individual. The Catholic Church didn't, corral people into gay and straight. They saw that same-sex desire was an imperfection, a failing that could befall any person in certain circumstances. And I think, paradoxically, I don't often like to say this, but the Catholic Church is right. If one sexuality is not privileged over another, defining oneself as LGBT or straight will cease to be necessary. It won't have any social relevance or significance. the need to maintain sexual differences, boundaries and identities declines with the demise of straight supremacism. As we evolve to a more sexually enlightened and accepting society, heterosexuality and homosexuality will begin to fade as separate, exclusive orientations and identities. They may still exist to some extent, but they won't have anything like the significance that they have today. In that situation, the vast majority of people will be open to the possibility of both opposite sex and same-sex desires, regardless of whether they act upon them. They may be open to those desires, they may not act on them, but they'll be open to the desire. And of course, the need to label yourself as LGB or straight will correspondingly decline. Because in a post-homophobic civilization, which is still a way off, but we're getting in that direction, in a post-homophobic civilization, no one will care who loves who. Sex and love will transcend sexual orientation. Sexual orientation will still be there up to a point, but it won't be the defining feature. It won't be an identity that people need to assert and affirm, because the need to affirm that will be obviated by increasing acceptance and understanding. We're not there yet, but as I said, this, I think, is the long-term historical trend. And I think to frame our movement, the goals, the objectives, the methods that we set ourselves, we have to understand the direction society is moving in. We can't fight the battles of the past based on the thinking and reality of the past. We have to look to the future. And if we look to the future, then we will be better armed and capable of remedying the remaining battles we have to fight. Thank you.